In this workshop video, we're going to discuss the concept of narrative as part of the first year writing series on genres. If you haven't already viewed the content on summary or critical analysis and synthesis, you might take some time to watch those other videos to make sure you're familiar with some of these concepts, but you can watch them out of order and really have an okay time with the content nonetheless. Before we get into the actual content, I want to offer some sort of schema for how this brief overview workshop is going to go. We want to start with the idea of what is a narrative, perhaps by discussing what it isn't, before we get to the idea of how we're using the term narrative and how we use the practice of narrative within academic or scholastic writing as well as everyday writing. So when we're talking about how to produce these kinds of documents in the class, you feel a little more comfortable for how you're accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish. We'll get into discussions of tone and features of narrative specifically before we practice a discussion of that in terms of a specific text. So defining narrative, it's nice to start with the textbook definition. We talk about, this Latin term, narrare. I'm not going to say that right, but you get the idea. To relate or to recount, to recite. There's this idea of numbering when it comes to narrative. It's broken down into pieces. And if you think about this, every text is broken or breakable into pieces. It has parts, right? A narrative, we have names for those, beginning, middle, and end. Whether they have more parts than one doesn't really matter. We still have at least those three aspects. If you can break it down into a beginning, middle, and end, it's probably a narrative. So we have all kinds of examples of genres that we can find in narrative. We find them in fiction, we find them in films, we find them in comic strips, we find them in words and memes. If you can take something apart, it's probably a part of a narrative. So narrative, it's important to appreciate, runs from the smallest element, a word, all the way to the longest novel or something in that way. So whether you're reading a 2,000-page novel or whether you're reading a one-sentence story, you can find narrative. So don't let this traditional concept of how you might see narratives being, well, I've got to have characters and actions and a plot, dissuade you from thinking there are small episodes of narrative in a lot of the things we're seeing. From the art on the wall nearby you, from the last text you've got, there's a story. And that's really what's at the heart of narrative here. For our purposes here at the university, we'll be a little more abstract in that way. We talk about, well, why do we tell stories? Before we get there, though, we ask the question, why do humans tell stories? And there are a lot of, not just theories, but suggestions for why we do that. We pass on information. So, for example, never to put a penny in the outlet of a wall because if you do, you probably get electrocuted. That's a story, right? And knowing that or having heard that, you know now, I never need to do that. So the idea of storytelling perhaps originated in the idea that if I pass on what I've learned in my life or what I've seen in my life to someone else, I'm saving time, I'm saving lives, and in that way we get this birth of storytelling as some sort of life-saving feature. It's also a way for comforting ourselves, right? We like stories, familiar stories. Think about how fairy tales work for children. Think about the stories you're familiar with that kind of give you comfort. We also use it to control events. Think about how news works. The way a story is told, the way a picture is captioned, that conveys a lot of information about a narrative. So in that way we're able to control events. Think about how the media is portrayed, for example, how the media portrays things. But ultimately, narrative is about giving meaning to something. And as we think about that, and we apply it to the lens of how it works for the academy or a university or any sort of scholastic mode, we think about, well, academics are humans too, and they have similar purposes, but a little bit more refined or differentiable here. So we do it to share information, right? You want to tell a story about how you came upon an idea, for example, or the process by which you reached a conclusion. You want to control events just the same as you do in everyday situations and manipulate information. You want to be able to arrange things so others can follow your oftentimes complicated thinking, right? So telling a story is to give meaning. And specifically for our purposes, we talk about giving meaning in an academic context, which is a little bit more abstruse and out here. And so we want to think about, well, why do academics really tell stories? To give meaning to something that really isn't, obvious or everyday yet. We want to kind of get it out there so more people can read about it. What I'd like to do, for example, for a moment is compare the film Memento in a history textbook. So you get an academic text and you get a popular text. If you're not familiar with Memento, it's a film and it is out of order. It's told out of sequence. It doesn't go scene 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It maybe goes scene 12, 5, 7, 3, 2. And in the way it's told, it's out of order, and we're kind of creative about how we tell stories because how the story is told is part of the story for popular readings like that. However, when you get something like a history textbook, think about how straightforward it is. It starts in the past, moves to the present, and it's structured, it's labeled. It goes year by year by year, or theme by theme across time, right? So there's a difference in the way we tell stories, whether it's for popular purposes, we think about creative fiction, for example, and how we tell stories in terms of nonfiction or academic modes. So as we kind of branch off towards these academic ideas, you want to be thinking about how do academic texts tell stories? Because in a class like your rhetoric and narrative class, for example, you do read a lot of stories, but these aren't your traditional fairy tale stories or novels. These are instead narratives of workplace organizations, for example, and they don't read the same way. But you still need to have tools to understand and discuss them. So we shift to the idea of tone and storytelling. When we talk about tone, we talk about how to retell a story. So perspective and tense are crucial ideas when it comes to explaining a text. You are a reader reading a text in which someone is explaining an idea. That's already very layered, right? Now imagine the person whose work you're reading is citing somebody else and all these other sources. All of a sudden you have information being cited by somebody and quoted by someone that you're now reading and trying to convey meaning about in your document. That's 4 layers at least, and it's starting to get very complicated. So perspective and tense are very important for our consideration. So you want to ask questions like, who's narrating? What's the position of the narrator in terms of relationship to the text and to the reader? How present are they? How credible are they? What do they know about that? Are they doctors of medicine talking about philosophical concepts? Are they ethicists talking about medical concepts? What's their relationship to the matter at hand? Tense. This is also an important idea that's kind of difficult to process, but I think easy to understand with practice, and we will, at the end of this workshop, do that. But thinking about when actions take place. If you're reading something of an academic text, that is an ongoing text. You're reading of it maybe in the past, but when you discuss it, you're talking about present actions. So when I read The Count of Monte Cristo when I go home later, I'm reading it. My reading may be in the past eventually, but that's still happening. So I can talk about how in the text Edmond Dantes is on a boat and he is doing these things, even though I read about it in the past. So that tense is a big idea here that we need to worry about. So when we're talking about relating events, when we're talking about tense and perspective, we have to be very careful to parse it out, because in our heads we collapse all those layers. So for our purposes, we need to think about what is the relationship from me, the reader, to the author or authors in the text and the subject matter at hand, and how can we use language in our descriptions of those texts to parse out all those layers of perspective and tense. So at the bottom you see a kind of a quick little red line that says MLA Tip. Whenever you're discussing a text, it needs to be in the present tense. No matter what you're reading, it is happening now. So those things that are in the tense, if you want to approach the past events they're describing, you've got to put that in terms of the present tense. And we'll practice that in a minute. So we're kind of halfway through, so I want to take a quick pause, press pause, read this question. How do you know when you've encountered a narrative, or what are its marks? So how do you know you're reading a narrative, or how do you know you're not reading a narrative? So take a few minutes to kind of ponder that question, and we'll come back in a second to give it a go in analyzing an actual video. Now that you've answered that question, you've unpaused this workshop, we're going to move into actual guided practice. We're going to take a text. Here, it's an actual, like a 7.5-minute video clip of Ferdinand the Bull from Disney, 1938 or late 30s, I think, adaptation of a book, actually. So for this, what I want you to do is, there will be a link provided for you outside, or you can just type in what you see here, or you can just Google YouTube Ferdinand the Bull, and you'll see this, I think, 7.5-minute video clip. So you can go ahead and pause our video and watch that video separately, because in the following content I'm going to discuss that as though you've already seen it, so it behooves you to have watched it. Plus it's a nice video, 7.5 minutes, and it's entertaining, good soundtrack, simple plot, but it's a good illustration of how to tell a story about a story, which as academics and writers of scholarship, we have to be very careful in parsing out those layers. So now that you've watched that video, and if you haven't, well, you can kind of assume that I'm assuming you've done that. And if not, well, this won't make much sense. So again, go back and watch the video if you haven't. But now that you have watched the video, we want to talk about specific aspects of that text. So we ask a lot of questions, and this is a non-exhaustive list, I think, of about 6 questions. Do we have a narrator or a narrating voice if it's not an actual specific human being? How does the narrator attach or relate to the actual narrative? What's their credibility, for example? How is the text ordered or arranged? Chronological, achronologically, by theme, by perspective, different points of view. You can ask these questions, and as soon as you do that, you start to break the text apart into how it works. And that's what we're trying to get at with this narrative, right? Are there characters present? If so, who are they and what are their relationships? Into what kind of genre does this text fall? And then, big picture, what are the steps of the arc? How does it move from beginning to middle to end? And just as an aside, it doesn't matter what kind of text you're reading. It could be an academic essay, it could be a short piece of fiction. Every text has a beginning, middle, and end. So when you think about how a story is arranged or how an essay is arranged, we can still talk about it in terms of beginning, middle, and end. So when you look at an essay, oftentimes things are broken down and labeled for you. When you watch a film or read a play, you see things are broken down into scenes. So we can count scenes. They're discrete numbers, right? There is a concrete number, and we can attach that, we can discuss it. So for example, in Ferdinand the Bull, we have several scenes. We get the introduction scene where we find out what's going on. We get the down the road when Ferdinand's an older bull scene. We get the next scene where he's actually in the bullfighting ring, and then after, right? So at least 4 scenes, and we could probably parse it down further. But it's a good place to start because now we have a way of breaking it down and talking about it at discrete moments. So we can offer some answers here, right? We do have a narrating voice. How does that person attach? Well, we're not really sure. It's someone who's talking about it who seems to have familiarity with it, so it's not very clear to us what it is about the speaker, that narrating voice's connection to the text. He seems to know something about the story, and he's the one relating the story. Can we question his credibility? Well, we don't really know much about him. All we know is that what's being described is taking place on the screen, which is a common trope among classic animated cartoons in that way. So how is the text arranged? Well, it's not a smooth chronology, but it's events-based, right? It's chronological, so it's important to note that. We think about the characters. We get Ferdinand the Bull, his mother, the other bulls, the 5 men who come to look for bulls, the bandolier, I won't say that word right, Bandolieros, Picador, and the Matador, right? As well as asking the question, what kind of genre is it? Well, it's an animated short, so that has certain features, right? So these are all important things. When was it published or produced, and who did that? Disney, 1938. And then we can ask the last question, what are the major points? We've kind of already answered that. And if you don't choose 4 scenes, you can break it down even differently, right? You beginning, middle, end, or just 2 scenes. But the question is, how are you breaking it down? Narratives need to be broken down into narrative moments that comprise the overall narrative. So this is why the rhetorical reading notes is a great worksheet, right? All these kinds of questions are things that are listed for you to practice asking, because while they may come almost seemingly natural to someone who's read a lot and written a lot about these kinds of ideas, for someone who's just thinking, oh, I like narratives, well, you might not think about these specific questions. And if you do, great. Then there are more questions to ask. It's a non-exhaustive list. The rhetorical reading notes are a model for how to ask questions or the kinds of questions to ask. So what you need to do as we go forward then is think about what we practiced or mentioned before, and that is the tone and the perspective. So I've just written out 2 stand-in sentences for how to discuss Ferdinand the Bull here. And we get the 1938 Disney classic, Ferdinand the Bull, relates the story of Ferdinand the Bull. Blah, 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 blah. Kind of circular, but you get the idea. In the animated short, its narrator recounts how Ferdinand the Bull was a different sort of bull who didn't want to fight. So we get a narrator in the present, marked in green here, recounting. He recounts, the narrator recounts. What does that person recount? Ferdinand was a sort of bull, so that event was in the past. The perspective then is being split up from present narration of a past event. Same thing in the following sentence. The narrator explains that Ferdinand sat on a bee, da-da-da-da. So the narrator, again, is doing that. Ferdinand sat in the past in the story. So when you parse out tense then, in this way you can actually achieve a sense of perspective for your piece of writing, which needs to be consistent. So whether you're reading a piece of writing which you write, the author discusses how blah blah blah, present tense, the author narrates, the author discusses, they discuss, they get to the point of illustrating, blah blah blah. Whatever it is, as long as you're focusing on maintaining your explanation of a text in the present, you can situate past events pretty carefully. But that is the important aspect here. So at this point, you should have a firmer sense of what a narrative is. Really, everything's a narrative if you want to be really kind of broad strokey about it. If you can break it down into beginning, middle, and end, an academic essay has a narrative structure to it, as does a short comic like Ferdinand the Bull, right? So as long as you can feel comfortable about understanding which perspectives to choose and which tone or which tenses to use to describe what's on the page or on the screen, you should feel more comfortable about explaining and narrating certain events, as when you might produce an autoethnography or describe an experience you've had in your writing.